There exists within the architecture of human consciousness a question that precedes all others. Not how one ought to live, but what one fundamentally is. This is not the anxious inquiry of modernity, though modernity has amplified its urgency. It is the question that stirred in the mystery schools of Alexandria, that echoed through the chambers of Neoplatonic academies, that was inscribed in the coded language of medieval Kabbalah. It is the question of structure itself, the metaphysical anatomy of the human being as a composite creature standing between worlds. The ancient term anthropos designated not merely the biological organism, but a cosmic principle, the human as microcosm, as living junction between the material and the intelligible, as the site where matter becomes conscious of its own imprisonment and its potential liberation. To speak of Trinosophy is to speak of this juncture with precision. It is to acknowledge that the human being is not a unity, but a hierarchy, not a simple substance, but a threefold articulation of being itself. In the Hermetic schools of late antiquity, this understanding was axiomatic. The Corpus Hermeticum speaks of humanity as suspended between beast and God, bearing within itself three distinct principles that correspond to three realms of existence. The Kabbalistic tradition, drawing from earlier Mesopotamian and Egyptian sources, formalized this as the doctrine of the three souls: Nefesh, the vital principle bound to blood and breath; Ruach, the psychological faculty of emotion and cognition; and Neshama, the divine spark that remains perpetually oriented toward its source. These are not metaphors. They are structural realities, observable in the phenomenology of consciousness itself. The alchemical language of salt, sulfur, and mercury, often misread as chemical allegory, describes the same threefold constitution from a different angle of approach. Salt is the fixed principle, the corporeal foundation, that which resists and endures. Sulfur is the animating fire, the principle of desire and individuation, the soul's capacity for movement and suffering. Mercury is the volatile mediator, the intellectual faculty that can ascend or descend, that bridges heaven and earth through the operation of mind. What distinguishes Trinosophy from all systems of psychological analysis or spiritual development is this: it does not begin with experience but with structure. It does not ask what one feels but what one is. It does not promise transformation but reveals the conditions under which transformation becomes ontologically possible. To understand the threefold nature of the human composite is to recognize that most of what passes for inner work is merely the rearrangement of furniture within a single floor of a three-story house. True metanoia, true change of mind, requires knowledge of the entire architecture. The metaphysical anatomy of the human being unfolds according to a threefold pattern that recapitulates the structure of the cosmos itself. This is not analogy but correspondence. The three levels of the human soul mirror the three worlds of emanation described in Neoplatonic and Kabbalistic cosmology. To comprehend oneself rightly is therefore to comprehend the order of being as such. At the foundation lies the corporeal principle, what the Kabbalists term Nefesh, the vital soul. This is the animating force bound inseparably to the physical body, to breath and blood, to the automatic processes that sustain biological existence. Nefesh is not consciousness but the substrate of consciousness, the life force that humanity shares with the animal kingdom. It is oriented entirely toward survival, reproduction, and the maintenance of organic integrity. Its virtues are those of vitality, health, strength, the capacity for sensation and instinctual response. Its world is the material realm, what Kabbalah designates as Asaya, the world of action, where forms are densest and most resistant to change. This principle corresponds to the alchemical salt, the fixed and coagulated aspect of being, and to the element earth. It is the body not as prison, but as foundation, the necessary ground upon which all higher operations must be established. Without a stable nefesh, integrated and healthy, the ascent toward higher modes of consciousness remains theoretical, a fantasy of disembodied spirit. The body is the temple's foundation stone. What is not secured at this level will collapse when pressure is applied from above. Above this lies the psychological principle, Ruach, the breath soul. This is the domain of emotion, imagination, and discursive reason, the entirety of what modern psychology investigates as the psyche. Ruach is the self as it experiences itself in time, as it remembers and anticipates, as it suffers and desires. This is the realm of narrative identity, of the ego in both its functional and pathological modes. It is the soul proper, capable of expansion and contraction, of elevation and degradation. Its world is Yetzirah, the world of formation, where energies take shape but have not yet crystallized into matter. Ruach corresponds to alchemical sulfur, the combustible principle, that which gives color and character to individual existence. It is volatile, subject to passions, capable of tremendous creative power and equally tremendous delusion. Most human life unfolds entirely within this middle realm, oscillating between emotional states, constructing and defending psychological identities, never suspecting the existence of either the foundation beneath or the principle above. The work of Ruach is integration, the unification of the multiplicity of subpersonalities, complexes, and fragmented drives that Jungian psychology terms the shadow. But integration alone is not transcendence. A unified ego is merely a more coherent ego, not yet a transparent one. At the summit stands Neshama, the higher soul, the divine breath directly imparted by the source. This is not a personal faculty, but a transpersonal principle, the point at which individual consciousness opens onto the universal nous. Neshama is not something one develops. It is something one uncovers through the progressive purification and alignment of the lower principles. It corresponds to the alchemical Mercury in its most refined state, to the world of Beriah in Kabbalistic cosmology, the world of creation, where archetypal forms exist prior to their descent into manifestation. Neshamah is the intellective soul, but intellect here must be understood in its original sense, not the faculty of calculation or analysis, but the organ of direct apprehension of intelligible reality. It is nous, not dianoia, the sudden grasp of essence rather than the step-by-step reasoning of discursive thought. This is the faculty that the Neoplatonists held to be divine within us, the part of the soul that never fully descended into embodiment and remains perpetually turned toward the One. The disposition required to engage this threefold system is not that of the seeker, but that of the architect examining a blueprint. Trinosophy demands intellectual sobriety, a willingness to observe structure without sentiment. Belief is irrelevant. The question is not whether one accepts this model, but whether one can recognize its correspondence to the actual phenomenology of consciousness. The adept does not believe in the three souls. The adept observes their operation with the same objectivity a physician observes the functions of organs. This is the fundamental distinction between initiatic knowledge and religious faith. Faith requires assent to propositions. Gnosis requires recognition of structure. The former is volitional, the latter intellectual in the classical sense. One does not choose to see the threefold nature of the soul any more than one chooses to see that a building has flaws. The revelation is instantaneous once the veil of psychological identification is pierced. Doubt in this context is not the enemy of knowledge but its purifying agent. The doubt that clears away premature certainty, that refuses consoling interpretations, that insists on precision over profundity. This is the doubt that prepares the ground for genuine insight. The aspirant who clings to comforting narratives of spiritual progress will never penetrate the structural reality beneath. Only the one who can endure silence, who can suspend both hope and despair, who can observe without immediately interpreting, only such a one can receive the imprint of trinal order. The metaphysical education of the soul unfolds not as accumulation, but as passage, a movement through distinct phases that recapitulate the soul's original descent into embodiment and its potential return. This is not biography but ontogeny, the inevitable morphology of awakening consciousness. The path is not chosen. It is recognized as already underway the moment the question of structure is posed authentically. The first phase is descent, though it masquerades as normal life. The soul, having entered into incarnation, identifies progressively with its vehicles, first with the body and its appetites, then with the psychological structures of the ego. This is not error, but necessity. Nefesh must be established, Ruach must be constructed, before either can be transcended. The descent is the soul's agreement to participate fully in the conditions of manifestation, to take on the weight of particularity, to become someone rather than remain nothing. In alchemical language, this is the nigredo's first operation, the blackening, the prima materia's descent into the densest state of coagulation. The soul becomes opaque to itself, forgetful of its origin, convinced of the ultimate reality of the world as given. This is the state the Gnostics termed cosmic sleep. But sleep here is functional, not pathological. Without full identification, there can be no later disidentification. Without the construction of a firm ego structure, there is nothing to serve as the vessel for subsequent transformation. The psychological reality of this phase is characterized by naive realism, the assumption that perception corresponds directly to reality, that emotions are justified by circumstances, that identity is a stable essence rather than a construct. Suffering in this phase is experienced as caused by external factors, by others, by circumstances, by fate. There is no interior dimension yet, no recognition that one's responses are functions of structure rather than inevitable reactions to stimuli. The world is experienced as solid, consciousness as transparent. There is no gap between seeing and what is seen. The second phase begins with a rupture, a crisis that cannot be assimilated into the existing framework. This is not chosen trauma, but structural necessity. The moment when the soul's trajectory encounters an obstacle that reveals the inadequacy of all previous solutions. In mythic terms, this is the dragon at the threshold, the guardian that cannot be bypassed. In psychological terms, it is the breakdown of coping mechanisms, the collapse of the false self, the return of repressed content that shatters the coherence of the ego. This confrontation is inevitable because the structures built during descent are, by design, insufficient for the entirety of existence. The ego constructed to navigate the social world, to achieve security and recognition, is too narrow to contain the fullness of the soul's actual nature. Ruach, having consolidated itself around a particular narrative identity, encounters material that contradicts this narrative, the shadow in Jungian terms, the unredeemed Nefesh in Kabbalistic terms, the unintegrated Sulfur in alchemical vocabulary. The phenomenology of this phase is unmistakable, the sense that everything previously relied upon has become unreliable. Relationships that once provided meaning reveal themselves as mutual projections. Ambitions that once motivated action reveal themselves as compensations for lack. Beliefs that once organized experience reveal themselves as inherited rather than verified. This is not depression, though it may wear depression's mask. It is the beginning of discrimination, the first stirring of Neshamah's perspective within the chaos of Ruach. The confrontation forces a question that has no answer within the existing framework. What remains when all provisional identities are stripped away? This is the question the ego cannot answer because it is itself one of the provisional identities under examination. The crisis deepens not because the soul is failing, but because it is succeeding in recognizing the constructed nature of what it had taken to be essential. The third phase, reorientation, is the most dangerous because it involves suspension between worlds. The old structures have been recognized as inadequate, but the new have not yet crystallized. This is the abyss, the dark night, the descent into the underworld that all initiatic traditions describe. It is not symbolic. It is the actual phenomenology of consciousness caught between two orders of being, belonging fully to neither. In this suspension, the soul experiences a peculiar form of suffering that cannot be named according to psychological categories. It is not anxiety, not depression, not grief, though it contains elements of all three. It is existential vertigo, the visceral recognition that what one is cannot be contained by any of the structures previously inhabited. The body continues its functions, the mind continues its operations, but the sense of indwelling presence has withdrawn. There is action without actor, thought without thinker, sensation without self. This is the alchemical solutio, the dissolution of fixed forms back into prima materia. It is the death that must precede rebirth, not as metaphor, but as actual cessation of a mode of being. The Kabbalistic tradition speaks of this as the breaking of the vessels, the shattering necessary before reconstruction. The Neoplatonic tradition speaks of it as the turning of the soul, the moment when orientation shifts from the sensible to the intelligible. What sustains the soul through this passage is not hope, but something more fundamental, the recognition that this dissolution is not chaos but process. The structures are breaking because they were always meant to break. They were scaffolding, never architecture. The suffering is not punishment, but transformation, the necessary friction of form giving way to higher form. This recognition does not ease the suffering, but contextualizes it, placing it within a teleological framework that prevents despair from becoming nihilism. The fourth phase, Ascent, begins imperceptibly. It is marked not by dramatic revelation, but by subtle shifts in the quality of attention. Where previously there was identification, now there is observation. Where previously there was reaction, now there is response. Where previously there was compulsion, now there is choice. Not the choice of the ego, but the choice of awareness itself, the capacity to pause between stimulus and reaction, and to act from principle rather than pattern. This is not the construction of a new identity, but the discovery of what remains when all identities are recognized as provisional. It is not a self, but a locus of consciousness, a point of view that is no longer bound to any particular content. The Kabbalists term this da'at, knowledge, not knowledge of something but knowledge as such, the capacity for direct cognition unconditioned by conceptual filters. The Neoplatonists term it the awakened nous, the intellective faculty restored to its proper function as receptor of intelligible forms. The ascent is not escape from the lower principles, but their proper ordering under the governance of the higher. Nefesh continues to operate, but now in service to conscious purpose rather than blind instinct. Ruach continues to feel and think, but now transparently, aware of its own processes rather than identified with their content. Neshama, which was always present but obscured, now functions as the organizing principle, the still point around which the other faculties revolve. The middle passage, the suspension between the collapse of former structures and the crystallization of new order, deserves particular scrutiny, for it is here that most aspirants falter, mistaking initiatic crisis for pathological breakdown. The distinction is not one of degree but of context and teleology. Both involve dissolution of established psychological coherence. Both produce profound disorientation. Both can manifest through symptoms that clinical psychology would classify as depression, anxiety, or dissociation. The difference lies not in the symptoms, but in what lies beneath them. Pathological breakdown results from the ego's inability to integrate traumatic material or to adapt to overwhelming circumstances. It is defensive fragmentation, the psyche's desperate attempt to protect itself by splitting off unbearable content. Recovery involves the restoration of ego strength, the re-establishment of functional defenses, the return to a condition of manageable coherence. It moves towards stability within the existing structure. Initiatic crisis, by contrast, is the teleological destruction of a structure that has served its purpose and must now be transcended. It is not defensive but developmental, not regressive but progressive in the original sense, movement toward a more fundamental ground. The old structures do not fail. They are outgrown. They become, quite literally, too small to contain what the soul has become through its confrontation with material that cannot be assimilated into previous frameworks. The phenomenology of this passage is characterized by the collapse of all reference points. The meaning-making structures that organized experience, narratives of personal identity, frameworks of value, assumptions about the nature of reality, all reveal themselves simultaneously as constructs. This is not intellectual recognition, but visceral experience, felt in the body as groundlessness, in the emotions as purposelessness, in the mind as the inability to grasp anything as ultimately true. Language itself becomes suspect during this phase. Every statement, every description, every attempt to name what is happening reveals itself immediately as inadequate, as a grid imposed upon something that exceeds all grids. The aspirant may speak of emptiness, of void, of darkness, but these are merely placeholders, fingers pointing at something that cannot be grasped conceptually because it is prior to all concepts. This is the nigredo at its apex, the blackening complete, the prima materia fully dissolved. In alchemical texts, this phase is described with stark imagery: the raven's head, the tomb, the descent into hell. In mystical literature, it appears as the dark night of the soul, the cloud of unknowing, the via negativa. In Gnostic texts, it is the soul's passage through the archonic spheres, stripped progressively of all that it had taken to be itself. What makes this passage sustainable, what prevents it from collapsing into nihilistic despair, is the recognition, however faint, that this dissolution is not ending but transition. The structures are not being destroyed arbitrarily, but are being cleared away to make room for an order that cannot coexist with them. The old forms must die completely before the new can emerge, because the new is not a modification of the old, but a different order of organization entirely. The temptation during this phase is premature reconsolidation, the rush to rebuild identity, to re-establish meaning, to escape the unbearable suspension through any available narrative. This produces what the traditions call false awakening, the construction of a spiritual identity that is merely the ego in new garments. The true passage requires something more difficult, the capacity to remain in dissolution without seeking exit, to endure meaninglessness without imposing premature meaning, to inhabit the gap between worlds without collapsing back into the familiar or leaping prematurely toward the imagined transcendent. This is why the traditions speak of this phase as requiring something beyond courage, beyond faith, beyond hope. It requires radical trust in the process itself, a trust that cannot be based on previous experience, because all previous experience belongs to the structure being dissolved. It is trust in structure itself, in the metaphysical order that guarantees that this dissolution is not annihilation but transformation. It is the recognition that the soul cannot fall out of being, only out of a particular mode of being. The existential silence that characterizes this passage is not the silence of absence, but the silence of suspension. All the old ways of being have ceased, but the new way has not yet announced itself. This silence is the womb of transformation, the space in which the soul is remade according to principles it could not previously cognize. To speak during this silence, to fill it with premature interpretation or consoling narrative, is to interrupt the work being done in depths beyond the reach of conscious manipulation. What emerges from the abyss is not a transformed personality, but a fundamentally different relationship to personality itself. The self that reconstitutes on the far side of dissolution is not a new self, but the same self now transparent to itself, aware of its own constructed nature, capable of inhabiting its structures without being imprisoned by them. This is not enlightenment in the popular sense, not perpetual bliss, not the end of suffering, not omniscience. It is alignment, the proper ordering of the three principles under the governance of the highest. The body, Nefesh, continues its organic functions, but now in conscious cooperation with purpose, rather than blind enslavement to appetite. Physical disciplines, dietary practices, regimens of movement, control of breath, become not ascetic punishment, but practical techniques for maintaining the stability of the foundation. The body is recognized as temple, not in metaphorical piety but in structural accuracy. It is the ground floor that must remain sound if the upper chambers are to be inhabited. The psychological nature, Ruach, continues to experience the full range of human emotion and thought, but now without identification. Emotions arise and pass, thoughts form and dissolve, but there is a constant background awareness that observes these phenomena without being constituted by them. This is not dissociation, but proper discrimination. The recognition that feelings are weather patterns in consciousness, not the substance of consciousness itself. The ego remains functional, necessary for navigating social reality, for making decisions, for maintaining temporal coherence, but it is no longer confused with the totality of what one is. The higher intellect, Neshama, no longer functions merely as potential, but as active principle. This manifests not as constant mystical experience, but as periodic moments of direct insight into the nature of situations, the essence of ideas, the structure of problems. These moments cannot be forced or summoned. They arrive when the lower faculties are properly aligned and sufficiently quiet. They are characterized by certainty, without argumentation, by understanding that is immediate rather than derived, by recognition rather than discovery. This alignment produces a characteristic ethical posture that the traditions describe with terms like hesychia, stillness, restraint, measure. The one who has undergone this reordering acts with economy, speaks with precision, intervenes in the world with careful consideration of consequence. There is less urgency because there is less identification with outcome. There is less fear because there is less to protect. There is less need to convince others because the truth of the structure is self-evident to those who can perceive it and invisible to those who cannot. The reascent is not a movement away from the world, but a movement into it with different orientation. The hermit's cave was always temporary, a place of gestation. The work ultimately requires return, bearing what has been learned in solitude back into the complexity of relationship, society, historical circumstance. But now that engagement is grounded differently, it arises not from need but from overflow, not from compensation but from recognition that the same metaphysical structure visible in one's own soul is present universally, that to serve the alignment of others is to serve the cosmic order itself. This is what the Hermeticists meant by the Emerald Tablet's injunction, as above, so below, as within, so without. The inner temple, once constructed, becomes the pattern for outer work. The ordering achieved in consciousness becomes the ordering one brings to matter, to relationships, to institutions. This is not proselytizing. There is no doctrine to spread. It is demonstration, the silent teaching that occurs when structure itself is visible in how one moves through existence. The transformed individual bears a particular responsibility that cannot be shirked. Having seen the architecture, one becomes accountable to it. Ignorance is no longer an excuse, convenience no longer a justification. Every action is now measured against the knowledge of order, every choice evaluated according to its alignment with or deviation from principle. This is not burden, but clarification. The ethical life becomes geometrically simple, though no less difficult to execute. What cannot be communicated to those who have not undergone this passage is the quality of silence that now underlies all activity. It is not the silence of repression or the silence of having nothing to say. It is the silence of having integrated the abyss, of having experienced the dissolution of all provisional truths and emerged with recognition of structural truth. From within this silence, speech becomes possible again, but every word now carries the weight of what cannot be said, the recognition that all articulation is approximation, all teaching is pointing, all knowledge is ultimately individual recognition that cannot be transferred, but only occasioned. The ultimate fruit of this ordering is not power over others, but power over oneself, the capacity to remain stable when circumstances are chaotic, to remain silent when speech would be reactive rather than responsive, to remain oriented toward principle when emotion counsels deviation. This is the sovereignty the traditions speak of, not dominion over external territory, but dominion over the internal kingdom, the proper governance of one's own composite nature, according to the natural hierarchy revealed through the doctrine of the three. There is no final arrival, no state achieved that requires no maintenance. The alignment must be renewed constantly, the lower principles supervised vigilantly, the higher principle invoked through practice and discipline. But the work is no longer blind struggle. It is conscious cooperation with structure, the soul working in harmony with its own nature, rather than against it. This is what the alchemists meant by the philosopher's stone. Not a substance, but a state, the condition in which the volatile and the fixed are permanently married, the soul stabilized in its highest possibility while remaining fully engaged with the densest matter. What stands is not belief but structure. What remains is not feeling but order.